Hello and welcome to Exploring the Zero Trust Security Model. My name is Mark Simos, lead cybersecurity architect at Microsoft. I've been with Microsoft about 21 years and build a lot of reference architectures, reference strategies, best practices like the Azure Security Benchmark, V3 just came out, and a number of other sort of pieces of guidance like that kind of bring everything across Microsoft together to address the problems that our customers are facing in security. Tarek?
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone. My name is Tarek Dawood. I am a lead architect in the customer engineering team within the identity division. And so I lead a small team that works with customers who are deploying identity scenarios, typically in a zero trust or a security overall overhaul and move to the cloud. And we learn and we bring the learnings back to engineering, and then we try to address by writing reference architectures, white papers. Mark and I collaborate on a general push with a big team across Microsoft that is kind of revamping and creating new content on how we talk about zero trust and how we promote zero trust to our customers. And what you're seeing today is going to be a product of that. Before we start, we want to call your attention to the aka.ms link here. This is a learning module that we have about zero trust security from our learning team. And the content you're going to see here today is going to influence. So the content you see there right now is current and accurate. And today we're going to show you basically kind of what the new versions of some of this content is going to look like. So you're getting an early peek. And as you go back to this module, you'll see it updated with the diagrams and the paradigms that you see today with us. So what are we trying to do here today? So our objectives today are to describe why zero trust is important to an organization. Zero trust, there's a lot of anxiety, fear, skepticism, cynicism around some confusion around zero trust. We hear it from CISOs, we hear it from implementers, we hear it from architects. And so we want to kind of, on the one hand, make it clear that we think zero trust is something important and valid and is the right approach for security. And on the other hand, kind of dispel and help address some of these questions and concerns. There are foundational principles of zero trust that make zero trust appealing. Microsoft has been doing zero trust for almost a decade now. So we'll talk about some of these principles that describe a zero trust strategy. And then we will have a section that hopefully kind of gives you the initial steps on how you can start with long-term vision to where you're trying to end up. So we'll talk about basically how you can start your zero trust journey, what you should go first, what you should do second, high level, the pieces you should be plugging together, and hopefully that will help you on your journey. And then specifically, we're going to focus on where Microsoft products can help you. We will show you both a reference architecture that's product agnostic, that is not Microsoft specific, and then we will show you kind of where our stuff plugs into, hopefully fill the gaps.
Cool.
Reminder, this is an live and interactive session. This is not a recorded session. This did not happen 2 weeks ago. So please use the chat feature of the session to give us, ask questions. We have a very talented and experienced crew helping us in the background. To name a few, Clay, Harish, and Nupur, Nidika, and others who are thank you to all of them in the background. So please ask your questions. They will try to address them when they can. And then they will also promote to us. Sometimes you'll see me peek that way because there's another screen there where I'm following questions from them that they feel, the audience in general should address. We may have a delay in addressing them, but we will, you'll see us try to get to them as well. And with that, I believe it's time to hand it over to you, Mark, to kind of talk about how we talk to customers about this stuff.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. So when we take a look at zero trust, it's something that affects and really empowers at the highest levels on the entire organization, from sort of the CEO and business leadership team all the way down into implementation. Now, it looks really different when you're looking at the world as a CEO and business strategies and markets and total addressable markets and all those kind of things and overall big risk to the organization. Life, it looks a little bit different than when you're actually working in your responding to a specific incident, or you're applying patches, or you're implementing an identity control, a preventive control, or something like that, or network control. And so the way we're focusing this, Microsoft does have a lot of guidance across all this space. So feel free to check all these different sets of guidance out. Many of the links are at the resources at the end. And the feedback, we're not just live here, but we're also just always looking to improve this stuff. So feel free to reach out there. But the focus on this one is going to be kind of the middle where everything comes together. So there's going to be some elements of the business leadership in the context of that. There's going to be some elements of implementation, but we're focused mostly on how does this all come together into a coherent strategy, into a specific plan and execution, architecture, policy, et cetera. So we're really kind of focusing on that band in this particular Learn Live session. So why is it important? Really, the thing that we've learned is it's important to know why, what, and how of any particular change. And this is sort of accounted for some of that confusion and challenges because different folks are coming at this from different perspectives, which, as we've seen, can be quite different depending on where you are in the organization. So let's start at the top. Let's get grounded in the basics, right? The world is changing from a market perspective. Even before the pandemic, digital transformation was very high on most CEOs' list because there was a recognition that, hey, people are buying things differently. You look at all the way back to sort of Netflix and Amazon and all these disruptive businesses that changed the way that things were happening using these internet connected services. This is changing markets, and this is changing consumer preferences. This is changing how citizens want to interact with governments. This is changing how the world works. And so businesses and other organizations have to adapt to it, hence digital transformation. We need to adapt this technology to meet people where they are. And of course, take advantage of internal process optimization, et cetera. So this, of course, then drives, we need new technical platforms that are, always on, connected, agile, all these things that a business needs to be able to meet those consumer preferences and models and whatnot. And the attackers, who were attacking anyway, saw a lot of opportunity as organizations were rushing these to market, oftentimes skipping security. And this kind of creates a dual pressure of a changing platform and a changing attack landscape that security is getting pressured to also modernize. And so that modernization is actually called zero trust. So the business calls it digital transformation. Technology often calls it a cloud transformation. Security calls this a zero trust transformation. These are really, in many ways, three different names for the same thing because the market is changing, the attackers are changing. And the big number one thing that we recommend for organizations writ large, and this is especially for the senior leadership folks in the audience, everybody is on their back foot. Everybody is transforming. There is not a 3 to 5 year plan with a month by month, week by week specific way of doing business, doing tech, or doing security. All of these organizations are changing and adapting as they go, dealing with the information that's coming in, running experiments, forming hypotheses, et cetera, to adapt to this world that is changing so fast. And so it's really important for everyone to work together because the set up a silo and then have a process that communicates once every 3 or 6 months to another silo, that really isn't sustainable anymore. And we've seen that kind of silo dynamic happen across all these different organizations that have been running largely the same for a long time. But the world is much more dynamic now, and so everybody has to be. So it's really important to work together as a team is kind of that key takeaway. Any other thoughts, Tark? Sorry.
No, it's just that it's realizing that it's the natural cycle of the digital transformation. And at the end, we will have references to the CAF, which is a cloud adoption framework, where basically this talks about the bigger circle, and then the MCRA, both greatly authored by Mark, which talk about the Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture, which is about the zero trust journey, the wheel specifically of that bigger wheel.
Cool. So what this means for security, which has, security is kind of a mix of the old and the new, right? So security is, there's definitely a lot of best practices that are well known for a long time, apply your patches and all that, but security also has this need to be dynamic as well. And as you go through this transformation, it's really important to revisit the basics. And so when you think about security, what is security about? It's about protecting the stuff that's important. It's about lowering the risk to the organization by lowering the risk that an attacker will control the stuff that you care about and do bad things with it that harm your organization. But at the same time, those same things need to be used by the organization to make money every day or to achieve a mission in case of a government or nonprofit. So the assets themselves need to be protected. People need to use those assets and access them every day to be able to access the data, the systems, the apps, the banking websites, you name it. And then these assets themselves need to change to be able to adapt to the way that people are working. We need a mobile app that now talks to this XYZ backend, et cetera. And the important thing to remember is it is really about those assets, what is important to that business. And so these are business assets, which are then mapped and into the technical assets, like the computers and databases and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, thinking them through the lens of the business is very helpful, we found, with Zero Trust. Now, you got to use them every day. So one of the number one things, as we realize that, hey, people are doing all this stuff, and it's not following our previous assumption that everything is behind the firewall on this quote-unquote safe network or this trusted network, we have to revisit access control fast. That is the number one thing out of the gate that most people associate with Zero Trust, because, oh my gosh, when we can't count on the firewall to do what we used to think it could do, we have to come up with a new access control piece. So that tends to be the first most urgent project. It's the one that a lot of people associate with Zero Trust. Now, the same dynamics that drove that are also driving other things as well. So we have to, as we innovate with security very quickly, we obviously don't want to be creating a whole lot of new brownfield. We don't want this net new application to be shipping without following the well-known, well-established security best practices and current standards. We don't want to be shipping new brownfield and making the problem worse and worse and worse with every app. So that's where the DevSecOps comes in. That is really, responding to that same business speed agility. Security operations, of course, the attackers are going to continue to attack every day like they normally do. They check in 9 to 5, whatever time zone they happen to work in or whatever the hours they happen to work in, and they are just constantly attacking for various different purposes, criminal, etc. So you need to be constantly responding to those attacks, and if they do get access, you need to cut it off as fast as you can to make sure, again, those assets are protected. Now, we mentioned that this has to be a dynamic thing. This is not something that is once set it and forget it, live in a silo kind of thing. And so governance, yes, I know there's a lot of security people out there that the word governance is not the happiest, sexiest, coolest word that you could possibly use. But the governance functions, which does include architecture, these things are what make security dynamic. And so the architecture and the architects team is no longer, here's a Visio diagram, come back to me in 3 years for a new version. It's much more of a dynamic engagement with the different teams, whether it's development teams, security operations teams, engineering teams that are designing and implementing the controls. It's a constant engagement model to really kind of bring everything together, connect it. Policies and standards, the rules, are actually changing on a regular basis. If you look at our Microsoft IT organization, all policies and standards are being managed on a 2-week sprint basis. So this isn't just security, this is all policies and standard for the cloud. But literally every 2 weeks, they're revisiting and seeing what they need to update, what they need to work on, in a very dynamic engagement model. And so really the governance piece is driving a lot of this dynamism. And then the last piece of this is posture management. You have to, as you have all these different kind of assets, you need to make sure, because you have this real-time data coming in, which is awesome. You can say, hey, are my things patched? Are they configured correctly? Are they exposed on the internet without firewalls? Are they configured? Is the multi-factor authentication required? All these different things. You have real-time data from the cloud. Who's watching that? Who's managing that? Who's interacting with the team? So you have this opportunity to take what is usually a vulnerability management team or person, and then kind of up-level that into a true posture management, so you can keep an eye on and keep up with all of the changes that are going on in the cloud and work with it. So significant dynamic.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind here is that you will have to think along the 3 axes: the security operations, the innovation security, and the access control. You will have to. We meet customers who are very good at one but not the other 2, or 2 but not 3. And the reality of the change we're going through right now is that you just have to think. And so we're hoping to give you kind of a structured way to address them, and also kind of what do we have as Microsoft to help you in that space.
Yep, sharing as many lessons learned as we possibly can, as fast as we can. So when it comes to, okay, so that sounds great as a final end state, but how do I actually get there? So what we found is that this tends to break down into a couple of initiatives. And I'll actually cover that one on the top right first. It's not really a formal initiative. It's more of a, most of the time it's just a check to make sure everything is there and, update and fix a few things. Ransomware tends to be the best profit model that attackers have, and it is growing because of that. It's growing at a really alarming clip. Some of these attack groups probably have budgets in excess of what a nation state could bring because of the sheer amount of profits that they've been able to pull in through ransomware. So we are talking about a serious threat, well monetized, well funded, a very, very efficient dark economy, as it were. And so making sure you're ready for a ransomware attack, that you have a good backup in place, that you can actually restore it, that everybody knows what to do, that someone in the PR and communications organization knows how to communicate with the world, and that you can actually restore the backups in the shortest amount of time, et cetera, and that the attackers can't reach those. So there's quite a few things there. We actually have a whole ransomware roadmap that we point folks at. So that's one of the things that, everything you do in Zero Trust will lower the risk of ransomware, period. End of story. But in addition to modernizing the security, there is also this make sure you're ready for the disaster kind of element as well. So the proactive initiatives that we find is that first one, that access control that we mentioned. Zero Trust Foundations really drives that. So setting up, making sure that the devices and the identities are in a really good state before giving them access to the resources. That's really what Zero Trust Foundations is about, setting that foundational access control, that first critical priority from that blue arc in the top left. Next one, modern security operations. Hey, there's a pretty good chance that the attackers can fish their way past the firewall. There is a pretty good chance that, there's more than a very good chance, there's an extremely good chance that you have stuff sitting out there on cloud and mobile devices that is valuable to the organization, and that would be damaging if it was compromised or altered, et cetera, by attackers. So modernizing your security operations to not just take logs from the firewall and block IPs at the firewall, but really thinking about, okay, how do I protect things everywhere? The devices, the identities, the apps, everything, wherever it goes, the data, making sure that all those things are protected, monitored, and you can detect and respond and recover from those attacks very quickly, and remove that access as fast as possible. So same underlying physics, but a lot of people don't think of Zero Trust and SecOps, but it is the same thing that's driving both modernizations. Infrastructure and development. As folks move to the cloud, awesome opportunity to hook into the app development processes, into the cloud migration processes, and improve security. Does that mean we can lock it down and make it so it's completely 100% safe? No. It means that we integrate into those processes and bring as much security as we can as we do that. And that's where some of the cloud adoption framework and the well-architected framework, the WAF and the CAF, as we like to call them, help with that security stuff. But that is another initiative we tend to see as organizations move to the cloud and stand up DevOps processes. OT and IoT security. If you've got these kinds of devices, which most organizations have IoT in some form or fashion, and many organizations, many industries have OT, operational technology, also known as SCADA or ICS, computers that control physical processes like manufacturing, delivery, chemical processing, et cetera, power distribution, all those kind of things. Those tend to be something that needs to be modernized. Again, very principles driven. We know some of this stuff is ancient. It's not going to have, SAML and OAuth and OIDC support. I mean, you're lucky it has IP support from 20, 30 years ago, some of these devices. So you apply the Zero Trust principles of that, which we'll be covering in a little bit. And then data compliance and governance. So making sure that you have the ability to do all of your compliance process, reporting compliance, doing e-discovery, et cetera, across the cloud and all these new resources, protecting the data wherever it goes, and then providing effective governance and reporting on that to include the posture management and some of those other pieces. So those are the typical initiatives that we do see organizations taking as they go through a zero trust initiative to modernize security. Tarek, anything to add there?
Just that on the infrastructure and development cycle, and we'll talk about it more in an upcoming slide, just recognizing and understanding that as you digitally transform, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. It's just there's not enough developers, there's not enough seasoned developers to understand the cloud, and it is not uncommon for people and things to put unprotected, storage blobs on the internet, that kind of stuff. And so it's really about putting systems in place that help safeguard your infrastructure and development. It's not about teaching the developer, wagging your finger at developers. Please remember to lock your ACLs on your storage. It's really about what are there, just like the same problem with security, where there's not enough security analysts in the world. You're not going to hire enough security analysts. So what are the systems that can put in place to kind of help make my processes more secure by default?
And a culture of learning, we found is critical, especially for those folks in the senior management, encouraging people to learn from their mistakes, because mistakes will happen. It's a normal human thing, especially in a transformation to an unfamiliar change. And so a culture of learning and reinforcing that, modeling that, admitting the mistakes you make so other folks in the team feel comfortable and they have that social permission to admit their own and learn from it. That is critical, we found, as a way to sort of make this transition as comfortable as possible, as smooth as possible, and help things out.
We do have a question interesting at this level that I thought maybe it would be interesting to address. The question says, do you see that in the future, AI will have a greater role in disaster control in the event of a breach? Well, let's say generalize it, remediation and or disaster control in the event of a breach.
My answer to that is yes. So AI is not some magic, here comes Cortana and, all of a sudden everything is coordinated and perfect. AI is much more of a, they're basic, compared to general intelligence of what humans have today. But the ability to process large amounts of data and take, stuff that, we expect, because it's really probability algorithms, is all machine learning is. But the ability to say, based on what we've seen here, we've gone through, 1,000 times what a human could possibly read or more, and we found stuff that's similar to that. Why don't you take a look at it? The ability for that to really take the burden off of people is incredible. And so as that continues to advance, I expect that to continue to improve security over and over again. There's already amazing amounts of things we can do. I think we process like 24 trillion signals a day or something at Microsoft of threat intelligence. Threat intelligence signals. So I fully expect that will continue as that technology advances to be able to do more through all these different things, through both vendor implementations like what Microsoft does, but also as customers bring innovation to it as they sort of get mastery of that.
Yeah, like Johnny, I feel you're a plant, because a big part of our message for you today is that a lot of the zero trust true implementation, it relies a lot on how much the system can help you notice and remediate attacks and threats, as opposed to relying on, there's a role for analysts and security, operations people to play. But if in the current paradigm, if you dump all the data into one place and hope that they just swim in the data and find stuff, you're putting them at a huge disadvantage. So the system has to help. So there is a level of AI today that can help you. And to your point, it's going to grow. It's going to get better. Maybe in the future, the AI will detect that there's been a, ransomware attack and the data is unavailable and replace it automatically from backup without anybody having to be involved. Well, wonderful, right? But in the meantime, at least, for example, there's AI today that can tell you about user risk, device risk, the penetrative, there's somebody floating around the system, there's unusual user behavior, that kind of stuff.
Yep. And we'll talk about that a lot more in the SecOps section, the security operations or SOC section. Cool. So principles and components of zero trust. So let's talk about what makes zero trust zero trust. But first, let's quiz our audience.
Hey, quiz time. So we get to quiz you first. Question. True or false? Microsoft first coined the term zero trust. A is true, B is false. Let's see your answers. We'll pause here for And
Yeah, it should be interesting because I know that there's been a whole lot of vendors doing a whole lot of marketing around zero trust. So I'm very curious to see what our audience thinks of this one. I should probably stop hinting at stuff. I don't know how to not talk sometimes.
And so, would love to also see if you think it's us. When do you think we came up with it? And if you don't think it's us, who do you think came up with it first? Would love to see.
Yeah, love to see some thoughts in the
some
chat.
of your theories on that. So
we get some interesting things on where people's definition of zero trust is and where it came from.
So here's the general answer from the masses. True. This is after 100+ votes, so maybe not the final picture. Okay, it's changing a little bit. True is 21%, and false is 79%. So the majority, the over almost 80%, think it's not true that Microsoft coined zero trust.
Survey says, sorry, I'm an old school American.
And you will be correct, folks. Yay.
So the term itself was originally coined by John Kindervag, of Forrester analyst at the time, I think around 2009, 2010. It was actually referenced to a more modern approach to network security. But zero trust has very much evolved since then, which we'll be covering in this section. So, and there we go. So the earliest formal traces of what has become zero trust actually date back to around the 2003-2004 era. And this was probably not by coincidence. This was, for the old folks that have a little bit of gray hair like myself, there was a sort of bad old days of Nimda, Slammer, Blaster, and these huge sets of viruses and worms that hit the internet, and that really woke everybody up to the importance of security and cybersecurity. And that was a huge wake-up call for the entire industry, Microsoft included. And it started a lot of work in security. We actually stopped development on, oh gosh, Windows XP. I'm starting to get old, Tark. At the time, and there's a lot of other stuff that happened in industry that recognized that, hey, security is important. But we also recognize that this whole perimeter and firewall approach that was pretty much the accepted norm of the time, and largely today in some places.
This was Bill's famous trustworthy computing memo, right?
Yes, that was what kicked it off formally at Microsoft. Yep. So that was a long time ago. But this really started some work on it. And so we saw kind of two different schools of thought. One was like, let's double down on the networking. We can make it better. We can measure stuff, and we can use that signal to control it. So network access control architectures, and then that Forrester term of zero trust, the first coining of that term. And then there's some Beyond Corp in a few books and whatnot that sort of went down that vein. But then there was also sort of a simultaneous, hey, it's not about the network, it's about deperimeterization, in the words of Jericho Forum, which is actually part of the open group where I'm a Zero Trust Architecture co-chair today. But that Jericho Forum kind of led to a bunch of different work that was really not about the network, like the assume breach philosophy of Microsoft, the conditional access, driving into passwordless and whatnot. The good news is what we're seeing here is there is a convergence. NIST work, open group work is really converging on it's both. It's not an or, it's an and. And that zero trust is really this modern security approach over everything, which is very much where Microsoft's position is as well. And so it's not a perfect consensus yet, but we are seeing this clear consensus is emerging, and it is forming, and we're seeing a lot of the work from various different organizations moving in that direction. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, the U.S. government agency, is doing some great work with their Cyber Center of Excellence, their NCCOE, to host a whole bunch of vendors, Microsoft included, get everybody to bring all the stuff in the lab and say, show us what zero trust is to you, industry, in this perspective. And so there's a lot of great sort of harmonization work going on there as well. And so we're very optimistic that zero trust will very soon be very clear to a lot of people in this view. Anything to add?
I was going to say, while it is easy to be cynical when you see all these, individual security vendors position their piece of the zero trust picture and say this is zero trust versus that's zero, it's the app gateway, it's the network, it's the identity, it's the governance, it's a lot of these things. But it's also important not to be too cynical, because this is the direction that a lot of very important organizations, CISA and the government, NIST recommends to others, CISA in terms of recommending to government federal agencies themselves. Both of them are heading in that direction, and so it's getting real. And so,
very much so, and very soon we should see some update to the original Jericho commandments from the Open Group as zero trust commandments. So that work is actually being finalized. I just voted to approve it as part of my zero trust architecture forum role, co-chair role. So looking forward to seeing that come out soon, which will also help bring some clarity to the topic. Another check.
Quiz time. So we interrupted regular programming to ask you a question. Which of the following is not a principle of zero trust? This is according to Microsoft. If you're familiar with our stuff, we have 3 principles to zero trust. They'll also be in the Learn module. In the revamped module, they'll be the same. They'll not change. What are those 3 principles? One of the 3 you see on the screen is not a principle of zero trust according to us. If you don't mind voting on the chat, let's give time for people to build up their votes. You've got least privilege, you've got trust as a vulnerability, and you've got verify explicitly.
Should I start humming the Jeopardy theme?
Go for it.
I don't know if that's an American-only joke. I don't know if Jeopardy made it overseas.
I think it made it, but I'm not sure how many people enjoy either of us humming anything.
That's probably a good point, yes.
Okay.
I usually opt for not humming or singing. Go ahead.
So we got about 100 votes in. The least privilege got 6%, which makes me sad. We'll get to that. But trust as a vulnerability got 75%, which I'm sure you're going to be happy about. And then 15% for verify explicitly. And do you want to tell us why the right answer is B?
Yep. So we'll talk about least privilege and verify explicitly in a moment. The trust is a vulnerability. We have seen some sort of more extreme positions around this. Hey, trust itself is a vulnerability. But it's important to remember that trust is a necessary component of a complex system. You look at the paper money that's probably in your wallet, or the plastic money, depending on local norms. There's a trust relationship there. It doesn't work unless you trust that somebody else is going to take that money, and they're going to take that and they can buy the things they want to with it. And so trust is just a necessary part of running a large, complex, distributed system. Trust is actually very important. Now, we can start with zero trust, and then we can build trust up and verify explicitly from there. But trust itself is not actually a problem. It's just unverified or assumed trust that doesn't have good evidence behind it creates risk. And so it's very important to remember that we're not trying to go to the most extreme. We're trying to come to a balance that enables a business and manages the risk and deals with the threats as they are. So that's one of the things that we wanted to emphasize.
I had an educational customer, tell me that they don't like the term zero trust because it implies too much security. Like, nobody trusts anybody, and they were more, trusting teaching staff and students, and they were not happy with the term. But wherever the branding wins, take zero trust. Maybe 2 years from now it's going to be called something else. The principles we're talking about today and the reference architecture, all that stuff is going to stand. And
those are very durable. Yes.
Yep. Let's cover the principles. We have a nice question in chat, but I think it would be nice to address after the principles.
Okay. So the way that we think about zero trust is, the previous way of approaching security, and this was often implied assumption. This wasn't explicitly said out loud. Sometimes it was. But, we're not assuming that everything behind the corporate firewall is safe, that it's a trusted network, which was the implied assumption prior. In most organizations. But what we assume is that it's an open environment, which means attackers can get on it, really any network, because these mobile devices are floating everywhere. The cloud services are over an open network. So essentially, we're working over an open environment. Yes, we can increase trust on some networks, but we'll never get to fully trusted. Or reduce risk, I guess would be a better way of saying it. But zero trust is really assuming an open environment where you have to validate the trust every time. And so this translates to assumption of breach. We assume that anything could be compromised, and we plan accordingly. Our preventive controls, detective, responsive. Obviously, we can't assume everything all the time, but we have to make that assumption and just operate with that healthy assumption in mind, that sort of, risk in mind. We have to verify explicitly, so we have to build that trust up explicitly using the data and telemetry that's available. And then we want to use least privilege access so that in case one of these things does blow up, which does happen, like a device gets compromised, a user account gets compromised, these are normal things. We want to make sure that we're limiting the blast zone, limiting the damage that could be done. Obviously, people still need to do their job. They need to access the data, the apps that they need to do their job, but we want them to have the least amount of privilege to do that as closely as we can, while still enabling them, so that in case that account gets lost, it's not, oh my gosh, we lost one account, we lost the whole environment. That's bad. So there was a question.
Yes, trying to get off mute. So this is on the terminology earlier. We were showing the slides. This is the Gartner question. SASE. Where do you see SASE fitting in with Zero Trust in terms of terminology? Do you see SASE gaining steam? Do you see becoming part of ZT? ZT becoming part of SASE?
So the way I see these, and I'd love to get your opinion as well. But the way I see this is it's in some ways it's a Venn diagram. These are based on the exact same security principles, as well as the sort of implied enable the business piece that you could add to this list, and it would feel just as comfortable there. So that is the overlap between Zero Trust and SASE. It's absolutely about that same kind of approach of things. SASE tends to lean more towards the connection and security of the edge. So a lot of the access control pieces and coming into the resources. Whereas Zero Trust tends to be a lot more overall security strategy. So they have a lot of overlap, but there's some parts of security strategy that don't have anything to do with the access and the service edge that SASE addresses. And there's some parts of SASE, as currently defined today, that are about network connectivity, enablement, and WAN, and some of the elements like that, that really aren't necessarily part of the security team's responsibility that would be under Zero Trust. And so there's a lot of overlap. I mean, it's like 60-80% or more between the two in my mind. But there are still some distinctions because of the different lenses that are taken with it. So that's my take on it. Anything else?
Yeah. So for those who aren't aware, SASE is short for Secure Access Service Edge, and it is kind of the terminology that Gartner uses to talk about Zero Trust versus Zero Trust, which, as Mark indicated earlier, is more of a Forrester term initially. And there is the two analysts maybe not acquiescing to using each other's terms. We'll put that aside. It's not our problem. But the thing that I don't like about SASE being the term that wins out is just the fact that it's so focused on cloud edge security in the way they talk about it. Whereas I think Zero Trust is just the right view across network and other things, like inside the on-prem data center. It doesn't. So right now, SASE carries a lot with it, a lot of cloud edge connotations, which I'd love for it to not carry as much. And so that's why I prefer Zero Trust personally.
It brings an important spotlight to that area, but it is not quite as comprehensive to the full set of problems that Zero Trust is.
Second question from our engaged audience. And I'm not sure we want to answer it fully, but the question says, Zero Trust is needed thing in the cloud. We cannot anymore work inside of isolated data centers, so we need to have identity and access management in place, have security posture, all that. So they're all alignment with us. They're asking about the roadmap. What is the next thing you see Zero Trust? Where do you see it heading? How do you see it evolving from now?
So it's a really good question. I mean, the big thing that we're focusing on from a Microsoft perspective is really sort of the execution of it, because of how broad Zero Trust is. It's not necessarily about the next product or feature, because there's always enhancements coming from each of the engineering teams in each of the different areas. And they're doing good work to not only introduce new things, but also refine the connections and the integrations between them and how the current ones work. It's really about, the big focus that we're focused on is how do we help customers get on this journey? And that's part of what this session is about, is really how do we accelerate that and make it as easy as possible. Here's a ready-made plan. Here's who does what. So we're really looking at that as sort of the frontier of zero trust is really getting it done, because in a lot of ways security is about getting to that hygiene state, getting to that known good state.
Agree. And I think today we want to make it real for you, and so we want to focus on, while we'd love to talk about what's next, I think there is a genuine challenge for customers to start adopting zero trust today, and that's kind of what we're focusing on. So let's spark the future conversations and then get down to next.
So one of the things we want to highlight here, and we're going to go through a couple of different models that describe zero trust. Microsoft's, the Open Group, CISA. I don't think we're covering the CISA one. The NIST one we will cover. But effectively, we're actively working with all these organizations because we know it's really important to our customers and to the industry and the world at large to have this clear view on zero trust that everybody agrees on. And so we're definitely doing our part there. I'm personally working with NIST a lot. I work, like I said, I'm a co-chair of the Zero Trust Architecture Forum in the Open Group, which is a partnership between the SAPSA and the Open Group to help drive some open standards with it, and really doing our part to try and harmonize this so we can get to that clear vision that everybody agrees on as quickly as possible. So, this is the NIST Zero Trust architecture that's being used for that Cyber Center of Excellence that I mentioned. And this, honestly, was one of the few consistent visuals or messages that we saw when, somewhere around 20 or 30 different vendors were presenting. So it was really good to see that beginning of that consensus. And so we're starting to see a lot of coalescing around this, which is a very good thing in my view. And the Open Group one, so this one takes a slightly different view of it. And actually, we contributed this as Microsoft, and then we've also taken back from it our cloud adoption framework. You'll see some of these terminologies from that kind of turbocharger graphic in the very beginning do map to this quite closely. So there's been a lot of positive exchange and information sharing within the Open Group, which is actually, I get to work with some of the original Jericho Forum people, so that's where kind of a geek out moment for me. So access control, that first most important thing, all these different, full-time employee, vendor, partner, you name it, users, accounts, devices have to have access to the resources, APIs, et cetera, that they need. And then the security operations has to be there managing the threats as these things go through. And keeping keeping an eye on stuff and having the detect, respond, recover. And then the governance piece is sort of the other part of visibility, not just the hot real-time pieces, but that sort of calm, big picture view. Are we actually making progress? Do we have coverage across all of the different assets? Or do we have visibility into them? Do we have policy for all these things? Kind of helping, with that other kind of visibility, for kind of make a visibility sandwich there. And then the assets and the resources themselves need to be protected. So not every way of getting to the resources comes through an authorized channel. So, this is why you need encryption at rest, encryption at transit, and some of those kind of elements. And so that's the asset protection piece. And so we really like these a lot at Microsoft, which is why we drew them right back into our cloud adoption framework. So let's see, where are we? Okay. And so when we take a look at the way that Microsoft's model is built on this, is effectively, we just break it down into sort of these technical pillars. There's identities, because the important thing here is that zero trust isn't about network segmentation. It isn't about identity and access. It isn't about endpoints. It isn't about data. It's about all of them. And that's a very important point, is that you have to apply these controls. You have to look holistically as an architectural view at all these. You don't just put in one zero trust thing. It's not a 19-inch rack appliance that you bolt in and screw into the rack and power ping pipe for it. That is not what zero trust is. It's an approach to make sure you're applying these principles in the right place. So you have decentralized control but distributed enforcement across all these. So Microsoft, the way we think about this, you got your identities and endpoints, you got your app data infrastructure and network. Oftentimes the right is the resources and the left is requesting access to it, but that's not all things. And it's not just about that access control. It's about much more than that, as we talked about with the governance and the policy and the elements like that. But you're looking at, you want to have a centralized central control with policy that it will be consistently done this way across all these things wherever they go. Don't necessarily care about location. We want consistent policy enforcement. Sometimes location is a signal, but it is not the end all be all, how we set up a control. We got to do continuous risk assessment and automation over it, kind of projecting out. We need to pull threat intelligence and telemetry in from all of these so that we have that distributed enforcement central control and that whole system working together. So sticking with that sort of product agnostic view, this is sort of the level 200, the next step deeper of that, where you've got the policy, you've got the constant optimization and improvement of that policy, and then you've got threat protection that is running across all these resources so that you have kind of all those components running. And the identities span human and non-human. So these may be application services, etc. Got that strong auth and identity risk that you're pulling in as signals. The endpoints, they might be corporate, they might be personal, they might be BYOD, and those are going to be looking at both the compliance as well as the threat. Is this device compromised at any given moment? Same thing is true also with the identities. Then some of the stuff goes straight over a public network. You have no visibility control. Some of it runs over a private network and the resources are hosted in it, and you get the chance to do traffic filtering segmentation. So it's kind of a mix of the two things, and you need to recognize that duality as you reach your data, apps, and infrastructure. And then for the data itself, you want to classify, label, encrypt, prevent loss. You want to really have an understanding of your important data, not necessarily every single bit and byte and document of data or line in a database, but the important stuff is the first thing to focus on. What are the things that could damage the business? And then that's both the emails, the documents, kind of that free-forming, unstructured, but also structured. Apps, you want adaptive access to those apps based on how sensitive is the app and how important it is, and adapting to that so that you're putting the right security policy on and you're not slowing down, inconveniencing users for no reason. Annoying users is always a lose in security because they will find a way to get around the process and skip past it. So we want to do it only at the right times. Runtime control, making sure that you have visibility and control as these different things in that back end, in that infrastructure where the code and the bits and the bytes and the websites and the apps are running, regardless whatever it happens to be as a platform, that you are have a good visibility and control into that to protect it, including JIT and version control over it. And there's a lot of supply chain stuff that comes into infrastructure and apps as well. Always optimizing the policy based on the data that's coming in from those requests, from the network, from the data apps infrastructure, etc. We want to always be improving that policy and making it work for our users to improve and enable the business experience as well as the security posture. So this is the overall Zero Trust architecture. This is actually a new updated diagram from Microsoft on our Zero Trust architecture overall. And then the products themselves, you'll start to see some familiar names. Conditional access is a big part of that Zero Trust policy enforcement. Azure AD and Defender for Identity provide that identity signal. Defender and Endpoint Manager provide those compliance pieces. We'll cover more detail in a little bit. Defender for Cloud, Information Protection, and Cloud App Security are all really tailored to those different resources to extend the Zero Trust controls and enforcement of policy out there, with Posture Management and Azure Sentinel really giving you that overall visibility across from a security operations as well as a governance and posture management standpoint. So we're going to cover that in much more detail in the following diagram. So I didn't want to spend too much time on that one. So now the next section is how do you implement this Zero Trust model with Microsoft, and talking through that.
Thank you, Mark. So a lot of you ask us all the time, where do I start? What do I do first? How do I continue? And so we wanted to kind of give you what from learning from our customer deployments. There are lots of customers who are on the journey to Zero Trust at varying levels. Some are very beginning, some are advanced, some bump heads with us in terms of the latest and greatest and assume breach and all that stuff. But where do I start? So we kind of wanted to give you a bit of a roadmap. So the order we're proposing here kind of ties back to the order that Mark showed earlier in terms of the journey. And so the first thing we really think, we call that blue box up there, you see identity, we call it Zero Trust Foundations, which is the core components of user access. You got to get user access and productivity working, both. And it's important that we put the word productivity there because it's not just about putting controls. So putting controls that allow people to get to the stuff they need without a lot of friction such that they don't go and make up their own stuff. And so the foundations of this will be identity, will be devices, will be apps, and network. And we'll cover that in more detail in an upcoming slide. But we put then, at the same time, we put number 2, data compliance and governance, because that is a journey. Like, you won't be done very quickly with that one. Just like the apps pillar and the previous one, also you won't be done in a month, a quarter, and something like that. Data compliance and governance tend to have a long tail, but you should start. You should start with what is going to be your governance approach. What you should start? Who's going to work on classifying my data? Who's going to classify my apps based on their data and so forth. So,
yeah, do we have good backups against a ransomware attack of our important data? Like, can we actually run our business and get back up quickly? So, very much starting that journey.
And you can never say yes to that question unless you actually know where your most sensitive data is, right?
Exactly.
And I'll be covering the kind of the foundations part in the next slide. And then after that, we recommend you start working on your SOC modernization. So, and then there's Mark will take it over from there. We'll basically start talking about how can you get the most important signal to your analysts, and then also how do you, with the different offerings we have and how they kind of elevate and the way you address threats from, I've got this thing in a log file in Splunk somewhere, let me message the owner. Can you put more automation? Can you put more automatic response, remediation, things like that? The more the system can deflect for you, the better you'll be off, right? The better your SOC team will be off. And then the next stage is, as we mentioned, as Satya even mentioned in the keynote, that most companies in the world now are software companies, whether they admit it or not, whether they have citizen developers or seasoned developers, right? They're software companies. And so protecting your CI/CD pipeline, protecting your infrastructure and development pipeline is important, and you have to start thinking about it. How can a bad guy use that to attack you? How can a bad guy, as we saw in the SolarWinds attacks, how can a bad guy use you to attack someone else? And so you have to start thinking about these things. You're no longer in a place where you cannot inflict harm upon others. Sometimes you can inadvertently. So you have to start thinking about how these things are, how you're going to secure them, how you're going to secure the pipeline. And we're going to talk, and Mark is going to walk us through a detailed kind of example of how we do it in the Azure ecosystem, but acknowledging that you probably have a state outside of Azure as well. So there's AWS and GCP and so on. Absolutely. And then Mark, as Mark mentioned earlier, for some of you, there's a big chunk of you who have OT and IoT that you need to think about securing and locking them. And we'll cover that also in the slide. So let's cover the foundations. I'm going a little faster because we're trying to wrap up on time and maybe also leave room for questions. So this is the mother of all zero trust slides because it expands into all different components of access. We're going to start with the first click, which is identity. So here you're going to start basically thinking about the principle. The founding principle here is first and foremost, bring your identities into a cloud platform, obviously, preferably Azure Active Directory, right? Bring it to a modern IDaaS solution, a modern identity solution. If you're on a legacy identity system, you're not in a good place. So bring them to that control plane. Unifying your control plane is a journey. I'll talk about it in a bit. But in the meantime, start bringing those identities into that system and then give them strong credentials. Absolutely important. And the far right here. Give them strong credentials there. Strong credentials allow us to deflect bad guys. If not just to deflect the attack, as Alex Wynett always says, our director of identity security, that 99% of attacks would have been prevented altogether if the user simply had MFA on top of their password as a requirement. But if you think about risk, as if you click one more click, Mark, if you think about, and another one if you don't mind, as the engine starts to detect risk and say, hey, this user is coming from an unfamiliar device, from an unfamiliar location. He doesn't come from this country usually. She doesn't come from this Mac device usually. It allows the engine to start being able to challenge them for MFA. If they respond with MFA, excuse me, Now we know that this is a new device, a legitimate user, but on a new device. Okay, well, the system now learned, so the system will now adjust. But if everything is just logged as a risk event and it's up to your SOC to make sense of it, then you're not going to be in a good place.
Yeah, and it's important to understand, pretty much if you've got Office 365, you've got Azure AD, and you've got the ability to start turning on these capabilities. So it's really important to sort of understand that it's pretty much it's deployed for a lot of organizations. And I just also want to emphasize that MFA, like that is that, and then of course moving it on fully to passwordless, that is the way to get huge security gains and usability gains when you get to that passwordless. People love not having to remember a type of password. They just look at their screen and it logs them in with their camera.
Exactly, and that is I came here for that one line, which is passwordless, jokingly, because I'm in the identity division. I'm one of the folks who are driving passwordless as a feature and as a deployment. And so, yes, absolutely start thinking about passwordless. Where it makes sense, if you haven't started your MFA journey, consider moving directly to passwordless as part of phone sign-in for mobile, Windows for Business on Windows laptops. There's a lot of options. If you haven't thought about, if you're already in an MFA journey, think about where passwordless makes sense to secure your CISO, your CIO, your CEO, your privileged admins. So start thinking about that. So that's the identity quadrant up there, and it includes risk. And risk here feeds from a lot of systems. This is where having a platform that can bring in the fact that you look shady in exchange online because you're sending spam email to the identity system, so the identity system can start not giving you tokens to somewhere else, is important. And this is where having that connectiveness of the Better Together Microsoft end-to-end story helps a lot. Now, we'll move to the bottom right pillar, which is devices. So just like you manage your users and you give them credentials, start bringing in your devices into the system. Bring them to the picture, the fact that these are devices you own and manage or not. That is a very important piece of information that it actually would help your control plane make the right decisions. And so we strongly recommend, obviously, you manage devices with Intune as a platform. For Macs, you have Jamf. Intune has integrations for that. We have partnerships also coming with AirWatch and other platforms where bring the fact that these devices are managed by you and their posture is known to you. And then you can make decisions not just about the user access, but you can also start making decisions about the data. So you can start saying, okay, on this device, I'm going to allow the apps to have an offline copy because this is a device that I manage. On these BYOD devices, I'm more skeptical. Maybe I'll allow you to read in a browser on the mobile phone, but not allow you to save offline copies. And so the more you can bring into the system, the smarter the system gets.
Yeah, especially those EDR signals of, is this thing known to be compromised? Because I'm not going to let them touch sensitive stuff if they've got malware.
And for example, things like SAW machines and PAW machines, that's part of your device work, right? If you can actually start creating SAW machines and PAW machines for your privileged users, and they come from those and require that only people coming from those machines can do administrative and privileged operations within the ecosystem, that's much better. Yep. Moving on, so again, highlighting the system's ability to remediate risk. Moving on from this one, we'll start talking about what can happen in the applications. And here, actually, if you don't mind, expand the whole thing. There's one more click, I think. Yep, there we go. So here we're just gonna, and one more click just to finish, because I want to talk about the whole picture as a whole. So here, basically, you're gonna have to bring your application estate into that user access management system, and it's gonna be a journey. So there will be things, as Mark said, that are gonna happen naturally, like M365 with Azure AD. They're plugged in at the hip. You don't have to do any work, right? Now, but make sure that you start using the capabilities of this. So we've got the lower access box up there to remind you that, for example, without doing any CASB solution or MCAS solution or anything like that, you can actually say when people are on untrusted devices, they can view their email and view SharePoint, but they can't download offline copies. That's actually a control between Azure AD and Office 365 that you can set up. You can start bringing apps that are not naturally modernized through the partnerships we have in the bottom under Azure Active Directory Conditional Access, that green, above the green box where it says Citrix and F5. This is called the Secure Hybrid Access Initiative, where you can actually use those app delivery solutions to apply conditional access on the way to these apps that are maybe legacy, maybe they're header-based, something like that. App Proxy can give you the same capability and add to the Kerberos side. So if you have Kerberos-based apps, App Proxy is probably the best technology to publish them.
Yeah, and this really helps you apply all of that user and device validation goodness directly to the app access, you can do it through the VPN if you've got any of the existing providers pretty much use Azure AD. But this really gets you into that per app, really strong validation piece. So it really helps you modernize your existing legacy apps without having to really modify them in any significant way, which is a great win.
Exactly, and not front-loading all the safeguards just at the front door of the VPN, because the VPN leads to a sensitive benefits app and the not-so-sensitive company portal app, right? And then, of course, Cloud App Security. And this is a big broker right next to Azure Active Directory, which can give you a lot of control into what happens, especially with SaaS apps, including Azure, including AWS and Google, and Salesforce, where they can actually monitor the user inside the app and put policies. Hey, this user downloaded 4 gigabytes of stuff all of a sudden, and then you can kick in a workflow that says disable the account in Azure Active Directory or kill the session. And so this is what we talk about when we mention assume breach. Is that not everything? Yes, it's explicitly verified. So Azure is checking that the user is on a trusted device and is the user and is done MFA every time before it issues a token. But now the user's behavior in the app is shady. And can the system react to that?
Yep. Cool.
Cool. So that's the foundations. And I'm sorry I kind of breezed through it, but we're trying to get you also to the other 3 big slides. So with that, I believe it's time to talk about modernizing your SOC.
Cool. So I'm going to also continue to go through this quickly. The good news is there are long-form videos, about 20 minutes a piece for each of these sections. That are actually recorded, because these slides are downloadable in the cyber reference architecture, all these detailed ones at the end. So we will get you those links at the end so you can have a little bit longer form version of it. So looking at security operations model, ultimately, when you look at the team or functional model of okay, who does what inside a SOC or security operations organization, first and foremost, you got incidents coming in, you need to deal with those. And so you need to take a first look at those and figure out, is this something that we escalate? Is this something that we can quickly close? Or is this a false positive? And so really focused on, so that's what that team's focus is. This is a great place for automation. This is where the auto IR, for those of you who remember our company name Hexadite, that's where that technology evolved to automatically investigate, remediate. So a lot of investments into that for that particular area. The tier 2 is in a large organization where you do deep investigation. And hey, is this a serious incident or not? Or once it is identified as a real incident, let's go ahead and figure this out. Follow the path, look left, look right, understand this thing, and then kick in the remediation. If it had a major business impact, let's bring in the folks that can coordinate with the business. And then, obviously working and partnering across IT teams, et cetera. And then some organizations also have a proactive hunt that are looking to proactively burn down the attackers that are in the environment that manage to slip through the detections. So that's kind of that whole piece. And then threat intelligence really kind of backs all that up, enables and empowers that, which is sometimes a dedicated team. So going through this very quickly, we have a much longer form version of it. But that's basically the composition of a SOC or security operations organization when it is fully populated. When you look at sort of what is the problem that the security operations solves, is they've got to cover the kill chain, which could include all of our favorite phishing emails, browsing a website, et cetera, exploiting an endpoint, all the way to including, coming in through an IoT device, or targeting and going after the OT environment, the factory or other physical processes. And then, of course, all the ability to navigate, laterally traverse within the organization. And so Microsoft is very focused on, to support that zero trust piece. So we need to cover this wherever it is, inside, outside the firewall. Let's go ahead and put some capabilities in there that can cover those pieces. Make sure that we can cover those IoT entrance points as well as those OT attacks and what goes on in those environments. Bought a company named CyberX a little over a year ago. And now Defender for IoT that also covers OT, covering that. And then the identity piece for both on-prem and cloud identities, and then the cloud app security. Now Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. Haven't changed the names on the slide yet. Apologize. Didn't quite get to that one for this Ignite session, but we will for the final version of this course. And that gives us really good coverage on the external threats. And then Azure Sentinel, of course, brings all these together along with any other sort of arbitrary logs like firewall logs or storage logs or Windows logs, Linux logs, you name it. That does all the good things that a SIM does to bring this plus those together. And then insider risks we also focus on as well. Sometimes this involves the SOC. Sometimes this is a little bit more of a different department within the organization that looks at those kinds of internal issues, but kind of varies per organization. And so security operations, the reference architecture itself, most organizations have started on a journey to take a whole bunch of logs, throw them in a SIM. That tends to be the classic model. The big thing that Microsoft invested in that is super important to your Zero Trust modernization is sort of that XDR layer, what we now call XDR. This is where EDR's endpoint detection response is. XDR is, extended detection and response, which basically says we're going to take a look at, instead of just raw logs and then doing some searches and queries and analytics on it, we're going to actually take other data sources. We're going to focus on one thing at a time, whether it's containers, endpoints, identities, etc., and provide high quality alerts that are ready for an analyst, as opposed to a whole bunch of raw data that might be interesting or it might not be anything. So providing those high quality alerts that are then actionable, because we have a very people centric view of this. We know that the automation is an empowering piece, going to the AI question from earlier. But we know that we also need human intelligence because there are human attackers that are innovating all the time. And so it is very much a red versus blue, human versus human thing, as enabled and empowered by technology and automation like machine learning and AI. Huge piece of that enablement is SOAR, Security Orchestration Automation Response. That helps with automating and orchestrating stuff so that you don't have to be doing the same repetitive tasks. That built-in investigative piece that automatically investigates, etc. in the sets up remediation automation is built into M365 Defender, and Azure Sentinel has also got SOAR built into it. A little bit more orchestration, make sure we're connecting all the dots to the chats of the SOC analysts and all the different pieces, and then putting up a firewall rule, blocking something, changing something automatically, etc. And then, of course, all the traditional SIM, log analytics, and alert generation. All those kind of pieces are built into Azure Sentinel, which is our kind of our SaaS-based SIM solution. Anything to add there, Tarek, real quick, or are you good?
It's just saying that the more you can elevate your SOC from the bottom layer higher and higher, the more they're going to be successful. The bad guys are hoping that your guys are at the bottom of that stack, and you absolutely owe it to them to give them more insights.
We got to make them work for it. We don't want this to be easy where they get to stay hidden for months or years. We want them to have to earn every little thing they get. And of course, we know that the SOC analyst doesn't operate alone. We know there's a lot of threat intelligence and learning and community that Sentinel and others are connected to be able to get queries and learnings from the community and others and experts. And we also do offer, both first-party Microsoft pieces to help with incident response and, investigation and, hey, here's something odd, et cetera, through Microsoft Threat Experts. But there is also a whole lot of really smart, really awesome partners that we are constantly enabling and empowering on this to use this technology to help our customers and sort of help them with that piece. So keeping going, just for time reasons, this is a view of the way we view infrastructure security. This one happens to be framed out as native security for Azure, but there's a lot of third-party capabilities, and these exact same principles also apply across AWS, GCP, and whatever other cloud providers you may have, and on-prem. So when we think about this data center and infrastructure space, and even the development space that rides on top of it, which we cover much more in the CAF Innovation Security module, we really are looking for two things. We're looking for visibility, and we're looking for control, and we're looking across the life cycle. Everything from the internal access, the workstations and the identity, all these things that are sort of internal as people are interacting with that cloud platform, all the way to the identities they use, the workstations they use, the interfaces that they're using to access the portals and CI/CD pipelines and what have you, the actual resources hosted on Azure, as well as the apps that are then sharing it with customers and devices and all those kind of pieces. So we're really looking at cloud security. When you look at infrastructure security, it's not just this infrastructure in the middle. It's all the different pieces that get you and your customers access to it, because any of those can and will be attacked by attackers. So how do you provide visibility and control on this? And this is where, SecureScore Sentinel provides for the overarching view, and then Azure Security Center, now Microsoft Defender for Cloud, really help pull together not just those logs, but also the alerts, those high quality alerts that the SOC can action on. And then, of course, because those workstations that people are using are probably in the productivity environment, that's where those kind of things, Microsoft 365 Defender kicks in. Zero Trust Access Control really has a huge, huge part to play to protect that. And then one of the things that we just want to highlight here real quick, we've got to keep moving quickly, but we've learned that classic security tends to fall, the classic security approaches tend to fall in what we call data plane security approach. And this really addresses all of those kind of east-west, north-south, different types of traffic patterns in and out of the organization, within the organization, and then protecting the apps, protecting the code, etc. But there is a new thing as you move to the cloud that we are extending back to on-premises, which we call management plane security, which essentially instruments the data center and makes it a virtual thing. And so Azure Arc is kind of how we extend this to on-prem, but it's natively built into the cloud, and you have the ability to apply policy and monitoring and all these kind of things by virtue of having a software-defined data center. And so you can do all sorts of stuff that you couldn't do when it was physically, some isolated system to badge into it, and then it was physically 19-inch racks. When everything is virtual and created that way, you can apply policy and monitoring to it. One thing I want to highlight real quick is Azure Security Benchmarks, the V3 just released, that's there in the middle. This is the foundational best practices that applies to all of this stuff. And it's infused into the well-architected framework and the cloud adoption framework as well. But the benchmarks are, so we updated that, we added DevOps, and we added some key management and some other elements to it, and we rejiggered the format to make it a little bit more clear, a little bit more actionable, prescriptive. So that just was released today, actually, I think. So again, moving very quickly for time. Last one is the OT space. OT is very different. Operational technology, SCADA, ICS, anything computers controlling a physical process. This is a very different thing. It's similar technology, generally tends to be older than IT, but it is a different environment, different rules of the road. Confidentiality is very much the lead challenge. Of course, availability from ransomware is running neck and neck as an important assurance because of attackers monetizing the availability of your data or the lack thereof. But what we're seeing in the OT environments is that safety is first, because these are controlling physical process. Could be chemical, could be mechanical, could be power. And so these systems tend to be in place for a very long period of time. We've seen equipment up to 50 or 100 years old, some of which still runs on steam. And these have quote unquote modernized electronics that were put in anywhere up to 30 or 50 years ago, from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, often we see technology in there. So oftentimes you're lucky if you have IP, you're definitely not going to have SAML or OAuth or OIDC. So the way that you approach these is quite different. You can still apply those same zero trust principles, assume breach, verify explicitly, and least privilege access. Absolutely apply. They just have to be applied in the context of that environment. So when you look at the Purdue model, this is kind of how the different technology, because it is fairly complex to be able to do these things. Often there's some reporting on, hey, what's our output? What's our, X widgets per minute, et cetera. And so there is often analytics that are going on. And we are seeing blended cyber attacks that, sometimes they use IoT to get into IT. Sometimes they get into the IT environment through a standard phishing attack, lateral traversal, and then they go after the OT environment as part of a ransomware or other monetization model, attacker monetization model. We do sometimes see cloud business analytics as well. And oftentimes the traditional approach has been isolation, segmentation, hard or soft boundary, internal segmentation. Microsoft's solution in this space, which is very much based on the CyberX technology, is to essentially do passive network sniffing, do some analytics off of that, and then you can have either an offline sensor or a cloud-based sensor that takes advantage of Sentinel and all of those different pieces. So that's the OT space, and we've got a whole set of resources we can point you to.
If I can add here, those of you familiar in the United States may have heard of the TSA mandate on requiring unphishable strong authentication OT for critical infrastructure, for example. So it's coming at you. The rest of the stuff comes together, MFA and unphishable, and the passwordless comes together.
Cool. So last things that we're going to point you to before we run out of time and get kicked out. Maturity model, very popular piece that is providing clarity on, okay, what does good look like and how do I progress? And very much aligned to this journey that we just discussed, that Tarek outlined. Business plan for those business leaders among you that want to plan it, think about metrics, etc. Deployment guidance, that CT guidance there. And then we also have some other resources as well, so we'll provide the links to those. And the cyber reference architectures for those dense, complex diagrams are published, as well as the program components, the asset protection and security operations, etc., are also out on the Cloud Adoption Framework, or CAF, doc site, and there are videos on each of the sections to explain those. And so with that, I think it is time to thank you all very much. Great questions. Really enjoyed the discussion, and hopefully you got some stuff out of this.
Yep. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate the opportunity and look forward for your feedback.
Thank you.